Chances are you are under the influence. Now, under the influence of what, you may ask? And that is an excellent question because I'm not talking about alcohol. I am talking about people. Now, I think it is true that pretty much all of us are under the influence of other people. Now, maybe there are some people who live very sort of monastic lifestyles or, you know, live up in the sticks and don't never talk to anybody. But for the most part, most of us are influenced by people. Um, at my office, there are other people in the office that are hanging around and and giving their perspectives on life, or at least I'm overhearing conversations, even though they're not my employees at this point. They're just other office people, and so whether I like it or not, I think about the fact that they're probably influencing me. Um, I go to church with a certain group of people, and I'm sure they're influencing me. Um, and I think, of course, the closer the friend, probably the more influence they have and things like that. Or maybe not even that. Maybe it's the amount that you respect a person. It's probably it may be someone online that you're listening to, um, and they may be the one that's really shaping the person that's really shaping your life. So I do think all of us are under the influence. One thing that Lisa from Crazy Eight Ministries talked about was how the time period it takes for someone to go from like a poverty situation to a self-sufficient lifestyle, essentially. So and of course the reason this is extremely relevant is because they help people who are in very tough circumstances, single moms with multiple kids and no job or that kind of thing, right? People who really need some help getting on their feet, they do help them get on their feet. And I think it's really awesome. But what she said was, so for different, essentially for different okay, so for a middle sort of a middle class person compared to a someone who's sort of the classic living life on the edge financially, or bad straits, whatever, living a life of just like kind of like financial dysfunction, right? um, and often there's a lot of other dysfunctions too, relational, spiritual, the whole package, and also that's why they address the whole person, right? So that's part of what's awesome about their program. But um, she was saying that to take someone from this really dysfunctional state to a state of like a stable financial state, and probably spiritual and emotional states as well. But she was saying that it takes about 2 years. It takes about 2 years for a person to be surrounded by different people for those new mindsets, those new ways of thinking to take effect and to really become ingrained. Now, she said also it takes about 2 years the other way too, right? So, there's sort of maybe the classic situation of, right, the teenager falls in with the wrong crowd, and before you know it, they're like out on the street, addicted to drugs and whatever. Well, there again, it may take about 2 years for that person to go from being that teenager, being in this like nice, teenager living a relatively clean lifestyle, to way out in left field. Well, it may take about 2 years for them to kind of fall, to kind of to make that switch. And so it's just kind of fascinating. That may be one of the underestimated elements or effects of the people that you surround yourself with. Like you maybe don't think of like, okay, so take like kind of classic networking theory and getting ahead in business, right? So the theory kind of often is like, well, yeah, you network with people of higher net worth, and then you'll get opportunities through them, and that'll help you raise your net worth, and that's how it works. And there may be some truth to that, but one of the other possibilities is that those people of higher net worth they have a different way of thinking, and that way of thinking is rubbing off on you and becoming your way of thinking, and that helps you to make decisions like a high net worth individual, and therefore helps you become a high net worth individual. Now, make no mistake, being a high net worth individual is not the end all be all. That is an illustration for possibly what can happen with the way that we're influenced by the people that we're around. And, if I do think it's interesting, and I think it's good to be aware that possibly, in terms of like, usually we think of like, okay, higher net worth, that means that's better, right? Like, unless you have like some kind of attitude against money or something. But generally we're like, okay, yeah, we're climbing the ladder. Like, that's good. That means we're becoming a, from the personal development standpoint, it's like, yes, we're personally developing. We're getting better and better and better. But it's interesting too. Like, I'm sure there's probably, I kind of view it as like each class is almost like a culture, if you will. And every culture, I think, has their good points, or things that are more biblical, and their weak points, or their bad points, in which their views on things are less biblical. And so it's not necessarily an indictment on in which culture you should be. It's just to be aware that, like, hey, just because if I'm transitioning up into a higher net worth culture, just to be aware that there's also maybe some bad attitudes there, right? Some bad culture that I may absolutely not want to adopt, even though I'm blessed to be in that situation, right? And by the same token, there may be, let's say, from really low income culture, there may be some really more biblical or more like higher, better ethics and better values that could also exist in there as well, in addition to the other things that you don't want. And so it's interesting to consider some of those things. And but do not, perhaps most importantly, is not to attach our personal value to where we're at in terms of our income level. And I think it's very hard not to some extent, like, have your identity tied to where you're at, kind of in terms of your income. Like, if you're a middle class, you're like, oh, I'm not like one of those people, who's always like, like, I'm not a white trash person, I'm not blah blah blah, right? Or if you're a high net worth, you're like, maybe like, oh, I'm not one of those small people who do middle class stuff, right? I have much bigger things I do. And so I think it is hard not for identity to be at least, influenced or to some level attached to where we are on our income. But as believers, hopefully, we can keep a bigger perspective that goes beyond all that, to where our identity is not in the stuff, it's not the bank account, it's not the status, or that's not where our status comes from, if you will, but it is from our relationship with Jesus Christ, and the value that the Father places on all of us as his sons and daughters.